Welcome back to How to Craft Fair. Recently, I asked my TikTok followers to give me examples of things that craft fair shoppers do that maybe aren't the best at craft fairs when it comes to etiquette. So my goal with this video is not to bash craft fair shoppers. It's pretty much the exact opposite. The reason I'm doing this is to give a direct link between craft fair shoppers and vendors without vendors having to say it directly to shoppers, okay? So I'm kind of being a link between the two, offering firsthand feedback from vendors. My goal is to just inform craft fair shoppers of things that you should avoid doing in order to make sure that everyone is having a good experience, both the craft fair shoppers and the vendors. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I've got a list here of 25 things that you should not do while shopping at a craft fair. Number one, not being careful with food and drinks around products. So it is easy to spill things or leave stains and whatnot. And, vendors' products are obviously very valuable and meaningful to them, just even besides their bottom line. Okay, so it's not even just really a dollar value thing. It's something that they created and it means a lot to them. So to see something get destroyed, whether it's from food or drink, it's pretty disheartening for a vendor. So just be careful when you are entering a booth or around a booth with food and drinks. And that way that'll help you get on the good side of vendors, just being considerate. Number two goes hand in hand with number one, and that is leaving food or drinks on vendor tables. So even if you're having a good conversation with a vendor, please don't set your food or drink down on their tables, because even though they're engaged with you, they are still trying to attract all shoppers at a craft fair, okay? So if there's food or drink on the table, it can appear unsightly and just, messy to other shoppers that might be browsing the booth. Also, on a hot day or something like that, drinks tend to sweat. So you don't want to leave that sweat ring on their tablecloth on a hot day or something. So just be considerate of this and mindful of this. Number three, letting kids grab everything, particularly fragile items. Now, most vendors will actually tell you that they enjoy having kids in their booths as long as they're being watched and stuff like that, or if the kid is by themselves, if they're at least behaving, mostly properly. But yeah, when it comes to kids just kind of grabbing everything, that's when it can become a little bit challenging for a vendor. It puts them in a tricky situation to, have to tell the child to, hey, be careful with that. And it just puts them in a really tricky situation. So it's best just to avoid this by watching your kids, keeping an eye on them, or if they are by themselves, to know that they can handle being by themselves. Okay, so there's a big difference there. And just try to use your best judgment, use common sense, and imagine if you were the vendor and your kid was touching everything, how would you feel about it? Would they be able to handle it? So just be honest with yourself, and if they can handle it, great. But if they can't, just be there with them to help guide them. Okay. Number four, and this one was mentioned by quite a few vendors, and that is having a conversation with your friend directly in front of a booth, blocking access for actual customers. So this one is quite a big deal because vendors are only there for 5, 6, 7 hours. Maybe they have just that amount of time to work with. So literally every minute that they're open to the public is very important. So don't rob vendors of opportunities to connect with actual customers. If you see a friend at a show, or you're connecting with somebody, or even if you're just kind of stopping and take a moment to chat with somebody that you're with, just step off to the side or go in the center portion of the aisle where people can still walk around you, or just make it so that you're not taking opportunities away from a vendor, okay? Because like I said, their time there is so precious and valuable, and just be considerate of them and their space. Number five, asking vendors to make trademarked items. So vendors shouldn't be doing this, period, okay? Because there's a reason why items have trademarks and brands are trademarked. It's that there is ownership to that design or logo or character or whatever. And vendors should not be making trademarked items. So to ask vendors to be putting themselves in a tricky situation just for your benefit, that's really not considerate of the vendor. Okay. So this is just something that, yes, you do see these items out there and, use of logos and brands and stuff, but that's really at the own vendor's risk. Okay. So to put a vendor in that situation is not a great idea. Number 6, and this was very, very common from the vendors. They spoke out about this quite a bit, and that is to take pictures of a vendor's booth without asking permission. So sometimes people will do this out of some sort of good intention. Okay. So maybe they have a banner at the booth and there's contact information and they want to connect with the vendor at a later date or follow them on social media or something like that. So sometimes there's good intention involved, but then other times there's not so great intentions. And that is basically to steal ideas, copy designs, all those sorts of things. So vendors will get uncomfortable if there's a lot of photos being taken at the booth, specifically like when it's of a specific product, things like that. So just take this into consideration. Ask the vendor if it's cool, if you take a picture and, give a reason why, hey, maybe you saw something that reminded you of a friend or a relative and, it just made you laugh or something, and just kind of set them at ease, okay? Because this is something that can make vendors uncomfortable. And if you're willing to take a picture, just go the next step further and be willing to communicate to the vendor, why you'd like to take the picture. So this is just one thing that's kind of like a considerate and consideration type of thing. And you should definitely be doing that if you take pictures at a booth. All right, number 7 is saying things like, I could make this cheaper. If you can make it cheaper, go for it. There's nothing stopping you, and vendors will always say the same thing, just go for it. There's nothing stopping you. So this is just one of these comments it's simply unnecessary. Okay. So if you feel like you can make something cheaper, then just do it. There's no reason to say this to a vendor to put them down and make them feel like they're beneath you. Number 8 is kind of a follow-up to the last point, and that is to say things like, I could get this at Walmart. Great, then that's fantastic. If you feel like you can get something handmade at Walmart, good luck. It's not going to happen. And, it's just another one of these comments that you got to keep it to yourself, okay? And even if you look at something and you feel like it might not be the best quality, or you're questioning whether it's handmade or not, make that judgment internally on your own, okay? And you're not forced to buy anything at a craft fair booth. Just like when you're scrolling down social media and you see something that you don't necessarily agree with, nobody is forcing you to get involved and comment on it, right? So just don't get into these types of situations and don't bring vendors into these types of situations. A lot of times they're just doing their best and they're putting their best foot forward at a show, and it's stressful enough to just go through a craft fair as a vendor. So again, this is one of these comments where, you're just better off keeping it to yourself. Number 9, looking at a price tag and audibly saying, this is too expensive. So sometimes vendors can actually benefit from a little bit of feedback on their pricing, okay? But there's definitely a right way to do this and there's a wrong way to do this. And a lot of times it can go south pretty quickly because it is a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction with some vendors to hear this type of comment, like something is too expensive, and get offended and get defensive, okay? So it's a little bit tricky. It's a slippery slope, but if you can approach a vendor in a way that is like constructive and positive, maybe this can be taken in by the vendor in a good way. But a lot of times I think you're going to get a defensive reaction from a vendor. So I think a lot of times your best way to communicate if something is too expensive is to simply not purchase something at the booth, okay? And if the vendor is not making great sales and they're seeing a lot of browsers not converting into buyers, they might start to get the hint that way that, okay, maybe I got to back my prices down a little bit or make my margins better by lowering the cost of my raw materials somehow. Maybe the message can be converted that way. Okay. So again, there's kind of like a right way and a wrong way to communicate some of these issues. for example, this issue, like something is too expensive, and sometimes the best communication is no communication. Okay, number 10, and vendors do get this one quite a bit, and it's almost like a little bit of an inside joke between vendors because of how often this happens, but it's to tell vendors that you'll come back and buy something, but you never return to the booth. So again, this happens quite often. If you're excited and enthusiastic about something, just go ahead and, either snag it or don't, just don't leave. It feels like you're fishing, basically. You're throwing like a lure out into the water and the vendor is getting excited to sell something and, it just doesn't turn into anything. So if you have intentions on buying something from the vendor, just try to do it. If you have to make a run to your car or maybe like the ATM machine, so a lot of times that'll happen where maybe it's just like a cash only show or booth, and you have to get cash at the ATM machine. Just try to like eliminate your distractions and go get that done and return to the vendor and make your purchase. So a lot of times shoppers can get sidetracked, so maybe they're making their way through a show, they have good intentions to come back to the booth, and then something will kind of pull them away. And it's never that they were trying to deceive the vendor in any way. It's just that, something happened, they didn't get back to the booth. But yeah, this is one of those things that happens a lot. So if you make communication to the vendor that you are going to come back, then just make the effort to do that. All right, number 11, and this is specifically for the outdoor summertime shows. It's when shoppers use a tent or a canopy for shade, but they don't have any interest in any items at the booth. So I understand that shows can get really hot. Especially in some parts of the country and some parts of the world where it can be absolutely brutal in the summertime. But just try to avoid this. It's just not a good look, for shoppers. And if you're going into a tent and a canopy, yeah, the shade is great, but please just go into it with some actual intentions to browse and purchase something if you like it. But don't just use it for shade, okay? Because at the end of the day, the vendors out there all day long, they're probably 10 times more overwhelmed by the heat as you. And again, they only have a certain amount of time to make good impressions on shoppers and only a certain amount of opportunity to connect with shoppers. So leave the space for actual shoppers. And if you're getting really, really hot, maybe go back to the car, crank the AC for a bit and cool down, but don't take away opportunities from vendors who are trying to make a good day at the show. Number 12, and if you are a longtime craft fair shopper and you kind of know like most etiquette, this one might surprise you to hear, but I had quite a few vendors tell me that there's a decent amount of shoppers that will actually try to guilt trip vendors into giving free products out of like pity, basically. This was pretty surprising to hear, but you do hear of this every now and then. Don't put pressure on vendors to do this. This is kind of weird, to be honest. This is something that you should never consider doing, and you don't really have any reason to do it. I don't understand this. Have you ever gone to a car dealership and asked them to give you a car for free? Have you ever gone to the store and asked them to give you something for free? Like, why would you do this? There's really no reason for it. So treat vendors the way that you would treat like a store owner, because that's what they are. They're renting a booth as a store for that day, a storefront. Okay. So there's no reason that you should be asking a vendor to do this and putting them in that kind of a position. All right, number 13 is pretty common, okay? And vendors do not want craft fair shoppers to try to haggle prices because it's a craft fair and not a rummage sale. So vendors typically will not budge, and they should not budge on their prices. Now, it's a different situation if a craft fair vendor is having a sale at their booth for a particular event. So, for example, sometimes you'll see things like bundle pricing where the craft fair vendor has a certain dollar amount or a certain percentage off when you buy multiple items as opposed to just buying one item. Another type of sale that you might see at a craft fair booth is a freebie given away when there's a purchase of a higher priced item at a booth. Okay, so basically you buy a more expensive item and you get to pick something, or you get something that is of lower value. So those are typical sales that you'll see at a craft fair booth, and those are set by the vendor for the entire length of the event. Now, what you should not be doing is looking at something that costs $25 and say, hey, I like this, I'll give you 18 bucks. It's not a rummage sale, okay? So vendors are pricing their things with their margins in mind. Basically, they're already going as low as they can go in order to protect the cost of their time, their effort, their cost of the raw materials needed to craft the item. All of these things are weighed into consideration when craft fair vendors are pricing their item already. Okay, so you're not going to see them say, oh, okay, yeah, I'll cut it in half, like just because. They'd be taking a loss on that item. So just respect vendor pricing at craft fairs. If you're looking for a deal, keep an eye out for those bundle pricing deals that I talked about, because a lot of vendors will do this where you can get a bit of a discount on multiple purchases or things like that. Number 14, smoking or vaping in or near or directly next to a craft fair booth. So this is going to be a turnoff of other shoppers. Okay, so this is going to be another one of those things that's filed under taking away opportunities from vendors by basically keeping other shoppers away. So just be considerate. You know, if you partake in these particular activities, find an area, maybe step outside if it's an indoor show. I mean, most places you can't do this stuff indoors anyway, but you know, go outside, or if it's an outdoor event, just kind of step away from the event a little bit and be sure that you're separated from the vendors. Number 15, and this one definitely struck a chord with a lot of vendors. There was a lot of passionate communication when it came to this one, and that is mocking vendors with their perception of how much work went into making something. So as a craft fair shopper, you really don't know truly how much work went into crafting something. And it's basically a slap in the face to vendors to say, oh, this only took 20 minutes to make. Why does this cost $50? So there's comments that just don't need to be made. Again, the best communication if you don't like something is no communication in most instances. Okay, so this is definitely filed under a comment that does not need to be made. Okay, number 16, bringing a pet into a booth. Now, we all know that there's a big difference between a pet and a service animal. So what I'm not talking about here is service animals. That is a different story. But with pets, it's a lot different. Pets are not easy to predict when it comes to a craft fair, because there's all sorts of different things going on. There's sometimes there's loud noises, things falling, or sometimes there's kids running around, and it's just a little bit more of an unpredictable environment where even if you know your pet pretty well, it's still putting them in a tricky situation, and you can't really guarantee that something bad is not going to happen. Also, there's just the whole accidental thing too. So sometimes a dog will get excited and kind of, jump up, or maybe it'll just even bump into something and possibly knock a display over walking by. It's just really not a great situation for a craft fair. Okay, so please just take this into consideration. Know that the vendors put a lot of time and effort into setting up their booth, and you don't want to come in and just have an accident happen. Number 17 is a pretty simple one. It's not saying hello back when a vendor greets you. So most vendors will say, hey, how you doing? And just at least acknowledge the shoppers that come into the booth. And it's always a little bit weird when vendors will do this and shoppers just don't say anything at all. So, and this happens like really, really often. So just at least acknowledge them back. You don't have to get into a super deep conversation, but if the vendor acknowledges you, the least that you can do is just acknowledge them back. Number 18, it's sad that I have to mention this, but stealing items. Yes, this happens quite often, and if you're watching this, please don't steal anything from a craft fair. It's that simple. So it it's really, really sad when this happens. Um, it's to me, if you ask me, it's so far beyond the level of taking something from, like, say, like a department store or something like that, where there's mass production of products. There's assembly lines of products being made, right? Think about a craft fair booth. People are literally taking time out of their lives as individuals to craft these items by hand, and they're being taken. That is, to me, the lowest of the low. People are out here trying to build a little bit of a side business, or maybe they're even just doing it for the love of it and the fun of it. And to take something from somebody like that it's bad. So as a craft fair shopper, I mean, the type of person who is going to steal something from a craft fair is not going to be watching a video on craft fair etiquette. So that I understand, okay? Probably nobody that I'm talking to right now is the type of person to steal something from a craft fair, right? But do your due diligence as part of the event, as a shopper of the event. If you see something happen, and if you see somebody take something from a booth, try to intervene if you can, and either let the vendor know, and a lot of times the vendor will let the organizer know that something is happening and give all of the vendors a heads up. So you can be part of a solution in either catching somebody or putting all the other vendors on higher notice to make them aware that something is happening at a show, and to let them be more protective and aware at their booth. Okay, so this particular point, it's not really to speak to somebody who's considering taking something from a craft fair, but it's to let you know that you can play a positive role in helping to prevent these things, or helping to stop it while it's happening. Okay, so just take that into consideration. Okay, number 19. This is a really, really tricky one for vendors to handle. Okay, so I'm glad that I can kind of relay it to you as essentially a middleman and a neutral person in between the two. But it's when shoppers have long, drawn out conversations with a vendor, particularly if it's about something completely random and not even an element of the booth. Basically, again, don't rob them of opportunities with other customers. They only have a certain amount of time at the show, and you don't want to have them hung up on you speaking about something completely random, and they're there to sell, okay? And they're there to promote their business. So a little bit is okay, and some friendly chatter and banter, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, especially when, you're engaged in something, and especially if you're buying something. I mean, this is something that vendors really appreciate. Okay, so there's, again, a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. And if you're making a purchase at a booth, a lot of times vendors will get a kick out of learning a little tidbit or two about the shopper, and it kind of leaves a lasting impression and something positive for them to hang on to, especially in events where it's not that great of an event. This can actually go a long way. Okay, so really there's a time and a place. Okay, so if it's a busy event and there's a lot of people coming in and out of the booth, this is especially a time that you don't want to keep a vendor hung up on you for something that's just simply not related. Okay, and use your perception, use just good awareness to decide when it's appropriate to talk to a vendor for a little bit and when you should just kind of let them go to do their thing. Okay, number 20. This is a super basic one and very, very easy to prevent. Okay, so I think this will be a good tip for shoppers, and that is vendors don't like it when a shopper will pick something up and then place it down in a completely different spot. So it's okay to handle items at craft fair booths. Sometimes a vendor will have a sign that says fragile or please ask for assistance, something like that. Okay, so just be on the lookout for situations like that where the vendor kind of just wants a heads up when you want to handle something that's fragile. But in other instances, vendors don't mind when, you take a look at something, a closer look at something. Always be careful with it, okay? But always just set it down where you picked it up, because the vendors have to go through their booth a lot of vendors will do this maybe like once every half hour or hour of an event, and they'll kind of walk through their booth and just rearrange everything to get it back in order to the way things were. So this is constantly happening, and it's something that's very easy to prevent. So just if you pick something up, please set it down where you found it. Okay, number 21, asking vendors to hold something and then not returning to the booth. So we already talked about vendors being kind of interested in something, but sometimes shoppers will ask for holds, and this can put the vendor in a really difficult situation. And it's hard to decide as a vendor whether you should kind of honor a hold or just say, I'm sorry, I don't really do holds, because you never know when somebody's going to come by the booth and purchase something, okay? So to put a hold on something, hoping that somebody's going to return and buy it, is a little bit tricky. Now, some vendors, what they'll do with a hold situation is they'll ask for some kind of collateral. Okay, so it's like there's different things that you can do. You can have a physical object, or if the shopper has a certain amount of money down, maybe they can put like half the cost down as a real hold of the item while they get the rest of the money. Okay, so there's certain situations where holds work and where holds are basically just hollow and put vendors in a really tricky situation. So asking for a hold, you can do it when you've got something to say offer for collateral, but I would not ask a vendor for a hold if you're just asking them to honor it, okay? Okay, number 22, and this tends to be a pretty big issue at craft fairs, and that is when craft fair shoppers will drop their kids off at a booth that's geared towards children simply because they consider it a place for them to play while the adults go off on their own. So it's very important to realize that earlier we talked about craft fairs are not rummage sales, but craft fairs are also not daycares. Okay, so there's a right way and a wrong way to handle this situation with children. Now, if the adult is there and they're kind of watching their kid at a booth that's geared towards children, that's fantastic. I mean, that's exactly what that vendor would want. But it's an entirely different situation when you treat it as a place to just watch your child as you go off to enjoy the craft fair. Now, that is entirely the opposite situation and not how you should handle it. So again, there's a right and a wrong way. Please just be considerate of the vendor when there are booths that are geared towards children and how you let your kids be in that area. Okay, number 23, that's setting down personal belongings on someone's table or display. We talked about the food and drink earlier in the video, but there's other things that shoppers will do, and again, it can clutter the booth in an unnecessary way sometimes. So if you're making a transaction and you're purchasing something at a booth, if you have a bag, just, maybe set it down at your feet as opposed to putting it like on a display table. These are really minor details, and something like this can be easy to overlook because you can be kind of in the moment and talking with the vendor and wrapped up in a conversation, and you can set something down really just not thinking about it, and it's not something done out of like inconsiderateness of the vendor, but it could just be something that you're not quite mindful enough in that moment, and that is okay. But just try to be more aware of that situation. And if you have a couple of bags from other booths, or maybe you got like a backpack or something, just try to set it down maybe at your feet when you're doing, when you're making a transaction with a vendor or things like that. All right, number 24 is if you happen to break something at the booth, just pay for it. Don't ask the vendor if you should pay for it. You should just do it, okay? Because yes, accidents happen, and 9 times out of 10, these things are obviously not going to be intentional, but the vendor, again, they made something by hand. They took the time to do it. It took them experience to know how to do it, and it required the purchase of raw materials in order to craft that item. So there was a lot that went into any particular item in a craft fair booth, and if you happen to break something, just don't put them into the position where they basically have to say, okay, should I be nice to this person and eat the cost myself, or just ask them to pay for it. Don't put them in that kind of a tricky situation. Just do the right thing. Accidents happen. Yes, it sucks, but just go ahead and pay for the item. Okay, number 25. This again was a pretty common one that the vendors spoke about, and that is when shoppers of craft fairs will complain about the event while at the event to a craft fair vendor. Now, you got to understand that a craft fair vendor is not a craft fair organizer, okay? So the vendor really has nothing to do with how the show is operating and how the show is laid out, what kind of food there is, are the aisles big enough? All of that stuff is relative to the craft fair organizer, okay? So that is relating to the organizer. The vendor, they're going to be put in a really, really uncomfortable position when you start basically speaking out about the show to them, because they're part of the show. And a lot of times they got to make a good impression on the organizer in order to return again. So venting to a vendor is it's not going to help anything. It's not going to make the show any better. It's not going to put the vendor in a good position. If you have an issue with the show, what I would recommend doing is sometimes you can find contact information for the event organizer and you can provide them direct feedback. Otherwise, your next best bet is probably to go on social media and find an event page and provide constructive criticism. Okay, so point out the issue, but then also point out like why it was an issue in your eyes. And a lot of times this will actually help the show become better because you're giving that criticism, that constructive criticism, to the person that can do something about it when the show happens again. So a lot of times this is how shows actually improve, is getting this like constant revolving door of feedback on what's working well and then what could be better. And the organizers will use that information to make changes for the next time the show happens. Okay, so this was my list of 25 things that you should not do at a craft fair. I will be making a follow-up video on positive things that craft fair vendors enjoy, but I wanted to provide these tips first to provide for opportunities to make easy changes at a craft fair. So a lot of these things are very, very easy to do if you're just keeping the vendor in mind and the overall experience of everybody at the show in mind, so that everybody has a good time. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please check out my other craft fair tips and tricks on the channel and consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.